Hey everyone, Jay here. We've got a lot of new offerings beginning now and in the next few months to fit any budget and schedule. But you have to go to my website or be on my email list to hear about them because we don't use social media and we want to keep the podcast as free from promotions as possible. It's all at jbrownyoga.com. That's jbrownyoga.com. Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Who are you? Is this your first time listening to the show? If so, welcome to you. Or maybe you're someone who isn't a regular listener, or you recently discovered the show and you're listening to this well into the future from when it was first published. If so, thanks. I appreciate you clicking through the archives. Please enjoy. Or maybe you're a regular listener. You're listening to this the day it's coming out or the week that it's coming out. If so, what's up? How's your summer going? How are we doing? I was just sitting here looking out the window. And it is summer at the time I am recording. It is a sunny day and it's hot, but it's not too unbearable. Like I can sit here without feeling oppressed, even though I'm sweating pretty good. I kind of like it. It feels like summer. And I've just been sitting here waiting, for a thread, a little spark of inspiration for some words to lead us into this week's talk. And I've been sitting here for 40 minutes at this point, and I'm not getting nothing. And that is very unusual. Sometimes I have something in mind when I get up here. Sometimes I just start to hit record and it just comes out. But this is one of those situations where I am at a lack for any appropriate words. And it made me laugh. It made me feel like it was fitting. Because if you've been listening to the show of late, you know I've been kind of getting myself into the weeds in these conversations, asking these really big questions about consciousness and higher power and non-duality, And I certainly enjoy them. I think it's really interesting to hear different viewpoints and to see if I can articulate any viewpoint I might have. But at the same time, I certainly recognize that the words are often kind of getting in the way, that there's limitations to what you can do in a podcast conversation. And these things are really personal. And it's very easy for it to kind of devolve into some kind of like debate or like proving somebody right or wrong or what's your evidence. And I don't always think that that's very helpful. So I said to myself, and I think I said to you last week or the week before that, maybe it was time to like set aside some of these questions about consciousness and all the materialism and all this stuff. Like maybe we just leave it to the side for a while and get into some other things. But the forces that be had other plans in mind, y'all. And some conversations just came my way. Conversations that I didn't necessarily plan to have, that I did have. I will say they're not like previous conversations I've had on this because, my feeling around these questions is changing. But they're still the deep questions. What I would say is that more importantly, the conversations seem to be about finding bridges of understanding. This is certainly true of today's talk with Anoop Kumar. And I definitely didn't plan for this one. I talk with Anoop about the convergences that happened that led to its occurrence. But Anoop was deeply steeped in Advaita non-dual philosophy in his youth. And then he went on to become an emergency medical doctor, and he strides both worlds. And he's developed a number of different models and frameworks and ways of articulating these things that I think are really interesting and useful. And it was wonderful to have an opportunity to connect with him and talk about it. And it's my pleasure to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, I want to take a moment to shout out those few people who listened to this show and showed up to my workshop in Garden City, New York yesterday. Because I bet you're probably listening to that like the week this comes out. And we were just like in a room together, maybe yesterday or a couple of days ago. And it was really wonderful to meet you. I really enjoyed having a chance to give some podcast listeners a hug and have some practice together. It was very cool. Thank you so much. Really appreciated it. Speaking of which, if you're listening to this and you live in the vicinity of Manchester, England, or Dublin, Ireland, I've got some upcoming live events in a few weeks, and I would love to meet you too. If you're not in those places in the world, but you still want to find some ways to connect, there's lots of ways we could do that. I should mention there is still an ongoing discount on my teacher training. And then there's just lots of other individual components, practice stuff, discussion stuff, podcast premium. There's lots of options. You can find all of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, like I said, y'all, sometimes less words is probably better, so we're just going to leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side for a quick moment, but let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Anoop Kumar. Hello?
Hello.
Hello, Anoop.
Hey, how are ya?
I'm good. I'm Jay. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you, Jay. How's my audio?
It sounds just fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, Anoop, I'm already recording, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to consider us having just begun.
Yeah, let's do it.
Very cool. Well, I'm very appreciative of having this moment to talk to you today. Thank you for giving me this time. I really appreciate it.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
And I want to start by sharing with you how this came about, because we had an email exchange, but I didn't really share with you what led to us coming together, because there were quite a few convergences that have led to this moment.
Okay.
And, you emailed me, it was a couple months ago. Mm-hmm. And in your email, you mentioned that you were an emergency medicine doctor, but it was like you were looking at a new way. I looked at one thing, it was like beyond the biopsychosocial model, which is something we've talked about on this show before. Mm-hmm. And then I clicked on one thing and you were like talking about non-duality. And I was like, emergency medicine guy talking about non-duality. My alarms went off. But I was in the middle of talking about some other things at the time. So I put it in a folder that I have and kind of forgot about it.
Yeah.
And since then, there's been a whole bunch of other conversations happening here on this show. And I think they've kind of led to me talking to you now. It's like it's better that I'm talking to you now than a couple months ago.
Yeah, perfect.
And I would say the beginning of it is that for a lot of years, I would say even going back to 2009, when I wrote like an article about this, mm-hmm. I've kind of had an uneasy feeling about the using of like Western medical scientific lenses to legitimize the profession of yoga.
Uh-huh.
Because that was like I think an impulse that a lot of us who kind of came into yoga before it went mainstream, and then it kind of became popular and it kind of became a profession.
Yeah.
And at one point there was a lot of movement. I think, don't get me wrong, I think doing research on yoga is a very interesting thing. I don't think that's bad at all. Mm-hmm. But I participated in these meetings at this yoga therapy conference where they were discussing it. And it struck me that there was something fundamental about yoga that was maybe not totally in harmony or even at odds with certain aspects of like allopathic Western medicine.
Yeah.
And, over the years, I've been kind of fleshing that out. And more recently, over the last few years, it was really a question of, doesn't yoga teach that we live in a consciousness-based reality?
Yeah.
And I was kind of surprised by how many yoga teachers were very materialist in their viewpoints.
Yeah.
And then even more recently for me, and this is like a little bit of a long-winded way to get to you, but I had a bunch of personal experiences that have caused me to actually question some of the ideas I've held around non-duality, specifically as it regards like whether or not there's a higher power or a creator. And so I've been having a bunch of conversations around that. In fact, when you emailed me, I think I was posting an episode with someone where we talked about Vedanta and kind of like the debate between Shankaracharya and Ramanuja around Atman and Brahman,
Yeah. Yeah.
Just so you know, like that was what was happening when you emailed me.
I love it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, I've had people on who have a lot of different viewpoints. Within yoga, there's kind of a full spectrum, even from like atheistic to theistic even.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so anyways, all of this is to say, as I was getting ready to talk with you, it seems like all of this stuff that I just threw out there in a wad is kind of in your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
And I guess what I was initially wondering was, I've heard you made reference that you had exposure to Advaita, like non-dual philosophy in your childhood.
Yeah.
But then you decided to become a Western medical doctor. So I'm curious about who were the people who were exposing you to non-dual philosophy in your youth, and why did you choose Western medicine instead of like going in that other direction?
Man, Jay, you opened about 6 hours of conversation up now.
Well, I guess I'm just trying to know like how you got to your views, you know what I mean? Like where do they come from in your experience?
Sure. Okay, let me start there. So I was born here in the United States in Washington, D.C., and our family soon moved back to Kerala, which is a state in South India near the ocean. And we lived there for a few years, and I came back before I was 5 years old, or around 5 years old. And soon, I think within a few years, my parents got interested in an organization called the Chinmaya Mission. Chinmaya Mission was led by Swamiji from India named Swami Chinmayananda, and who was in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, in the Shankaracharya tradition. So I've been involved in those kinds of debates or learning about that. In fact, I played the role of Shankaracharya in a couple dramas when I was a kid. And one of the scenes was a debate scene where I was, making the arguments and so on. So I've been living this since I was, 10 or something like that. And so when I heard Swami Chinmayananda speak when I was 10, 11, something like that, it struck, I didn't understand intellectually what he was saying, but it just felt like it was true. It felt like there was something true in what he was saying, as opposed to when I was going to school, it felt like it was just parrots speaking, and that was the difference. One was the I guess the authenticity of the knowledge, but secondly, it was the depth of the knowledge. It seemed like this person was saying something actually that's deeply relevant to my life, whereas in school, it didn't feel that way. It felt like it was deeply relevant to somebody else, but not so much to me. This person was talking about mind, was talking about identity, was talking about who we are, was talking about the nature of the world. I think, in my view, all kids love that stuff because all kids are deeply immersed in that, but adults don't have the language to engage them. And then you have your terrible twos, and then you have your teenage rebellion, and then you have your adult midlife crisis, all because we're not actually engaging people at the depth of how they actually exist. And that became apparent to me very early, and I didn't really enjoy school that much, which is ironic for somebody who has actually been through a lot of school. But, I didn't like most of it, to be honest. But somehow I found myself in it. And to speak to your part about emergency medicine and allopathy, In college, I kind of just like roamed through the end of high school and college, didn't know what I wanted to do, dropped out of school, went to California during the dot-com boom, worked at a startup, was just kind of, worked at a not-for-profit, was singing. I sing Indian Carnatic music. So I was singing, I was just doing all kinds of different stuff, and somehow decided, somebody said you should check out medicine, try it. I applied to a school, I got in, and then next thing you know, I was in emergency medicine. My perspective on that was really, what do we really know about the human being? I want to know what the people who know. That was kind of my view. And I soon came to realize that in allopathy, we know a whole lot about a little, right? We know a whole lot about a narrow range of life, about a narrow range of being human. And that's how we model, human anatomy, for example, which is the map that allopathy is based on. It's human anatomy. It's not complete human anatomy. It's physical human anatomy. And that discernment, I should say, does not exist in allopathy. The idea that we are dealing with a part of human anatomy and not all of human anatomy. And so I just want to, there's so much to talk about, but just to complete this kind of introductory response, I just want to segue quickly to one thing you mentioned about the materialist framework versus, let's say, like an Advaitic or non-dual framework existing now. I think you would probably agree, Jay, that over the last century, and certainly the last many decades, knowledge from India and probably China, let's just say deep indigenous knowledge, has been adopted. Now, yoga is a household word. It's not an English word, actually, right? It's a Sanskrit word, but of course, it's an English word now. Meditation, of course, is everywhere. The word mantra or mantra is a regular part of the English language. A lot of people, especially people who are spiritually inclined, know about Vivekananda coming, and then Paramahamsa Yogananda coming, and many of the yogis that came over to the West and brought knowledge. So it's pretty much well known. And of course, that has seeped into even medicine. We now have integrative medicine centers in probably every major medical school around the country, if not most. It's well established even in medicine, but integrative medicine is kind of looked at on the side. It's a little bit different. We don't fully understand it. And you touched on a huge thing, Jay. I think the next shift that I've been talking about, and that I think some are ready for, many even within spirituality and even in integrative medicine do not recognize, but we have to declare, it's time to declare it, is that everything that we have kind of been considering and thinking about as either spirituality or the intersection of spirituality and science or quantum science or yoga, meditation, mindfulness, everything comes from a place that recognizes consciousness as fundamental. Not consciousness is an add-on to the brain. Not consciousness is something cool that the brain does that we can experience sometime. Not that we have to expand that consciousness so that we can fulfill our brain's capacity. No, it's far, far, far more than that, and far worse for the materialist, actually. It is that what we experience as the material world, including our own bodies and specifically our own brains, right? The Mount Everest of neuroscience, that itself is an experience of mind in consciousness. That is the fundamental tenet from which all of these traditions arise. And it is radical, and it's time we started to bring some understanding to that.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And that is what I was saying earlier, in the sense that what it means that the fundamental basis of the universe or the world is consciousness, not matter.
Yeah.
Is the kind of initial question. I think I have somebody on the show this week while we're recording who is what he calls religious naturalist. And he's a wonderful guy. I really like him. And he has a view that anything outside of the physical is supernatural.
Yeah.
And that there's no evidence for that.
Right.
And I guess that is what I was saying before too, about like the fundamental difference between yoga and certain aspects of allopathic medicine.
Yeah.
Now, allopathic medicine doesn't acknowledge that consciousness is the fundamental basis.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that has to do with our definitions and understanding of what consciousness is. So in Sanskrit, of course, you'll have, states of experience, like waking, dream, and sleep. You'll have words for intellect. You'll have words for chit, consciousness or awareness. You'll have words for sat or existence. And in medical science, there's basically just consciousness. And by the way, I use the word consciousness quite frequently in the ER, but we often talk about it as levels of consciousness or loss of consciousness. Like when somebody passes out, we say, well, there was LOC, loss of consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. But of course, I know the way I'm using consciousness there is totally different than how we have been using it so far in this conversation. So consciousness, for example, is not the same as being conscious of something. Of course, you're conscious of my voice now, I'm conscious of your voice, but that's not the same as consciousness as how we have been using it. So there's consciousness of something, and there is consciousness in and of itself without growing out of itself or reaching out of itself to be conscious of something. So that's an important distinction that's generally not talked about. That by itself should tell us, wait a second, so what is meant by consciousness is not what I usually think of as consciousness. What I usually think of as consciousness is included in it, but in fact, that's a small fraction of what we're referring to as consciousness. And secondly, when we talk about, there's this idea in philosophy of the hard problem, and there's another one called the real problem. The hard problem, I think, was coined by David Chalmers, who asked this question of, why it is that we experience everything, why it is that we experience anything. So just because we have a brain and we have neurons and we have neurotransmitters and we have dendrites and we have connections among these neurons and all this activity, firing electrical activity, so what? Why do we have to have an experience? That can all be there, but there doesn't have to be an experience. So we can explain all that we want about brains and dendrites and atoms and particles and so on, but it doesn't anywhere connect to the fact that, okay, so why is there an experience of anything? All that could still be happening. Why is there an accompanying experience? And that's what he calls a hard problem. And, I think it was Anil, I think his last name is Seth, Anil Seth, I believe, was a neuroscientist who kind of responded to that in a way with what he called the real problem. He said, well, the hard problem, we're just kind of ignoring the actual work we have to do. There's actually a real problem of consciousness, not just a hard problem. The real problem is, what is the link between these? What is the link between the physical brain and the neurotransmitters, et cetera? How do they work together, either structurally or functionally? And how do they correlate with this experience of consciousness? Like, what is the actual work to do? Let's look into that. So he called that the real problem, with a focus on actually doing the work of putting these two together. And I think there's a third one we need to talk about, which speaks to what you were just saying. And that is what I call the recognition problem of consciousness. And that is this question of, what is consciousness to begin with? I can think that I'm talking about consciousness, but it entirely depends on my own experience, right? For me, consciousness could be being awake. For a lot of people, they think consciousness is the same as being awake. So when I sleep, there is no consciousness, which is not true. Sleep is actually a state of the mind. And consciousness can be present even when the mind sleeps, just like consciousness is present and expressing through the dream state. Consciousness is present and expressing through the waking state, which we're apparently in now. But consciousness can be present even in the sleep state. Just because the mind is not aware of something other than itself or something that is distinct in terms of experience, it doesn't mean consciousness in and of itself is not there. So this to me is the recognition problem. I can try to find neural correlates through anatomy and physiology and functional MRIs, all that I want, and I think we absolutely should do that. I take the real problem seriously. Let's do that.
Yeah, let's look for thickened cortical walls, right?
Yes, right. Thickened cortical walls and all this. And I think we got to do that, Jay. I mean, that is a real problem, but to me, it's not the real problem. The real problem is the recognition problem. First, let me expand my own experience of what consciousness is. And only to that extent can I find correlates in, let's say, neuroanatomy.
Okay, I can really appreciate that. Like, I guess the question that has come up, I mentioned that there's some folks who've been on with more materialist views. Mm-hmm. When we talk about consciousness, they would say that consciousness doesn't exist outside of a body or a brain.
Yeah.
And, I've had other people on to talk about like morphic resonance or like remote viewing, Right. So I've tried to like find some kind of sources or kind of evidence, because that's what they want, for evidence outside of just someone's subjective experiences.
Yeah.
So if you're talking to somebody who doesn't think that consciousness exists outside of a body or a brain, how would you what kind of evidence would you use to say that it does?
So first I would see, where this person is coming from.
Right.
And if they're if they want to understand, that's the most important thing, because ultimately from the perspective of, let's say, the second mind perspective, we can get into the three minds at some point.
We'll get to the three minds, definitely. We'll get to the three minds.
We will get to that. But let's just say from the perspective of consciousness being fundamental, meaning that it is consciousness that appears as the pattern that we call matter, right? Not that there's matter and then there's some consciousness. No, there's consciousness, period. It is fundamental, and it expresses also as matter and identity and so on. From that perspective, there's no argument with the viewpoint that there's something called physical and there's something called consciousness, believe it or not. And here's why. It's because what a person is calling physical is the localized experience of identity, looking at something that it feels it's different from itself. Okay, that's what we call the physical world. Something that I recognize that is different and outside of myself that I can see. I say, I see, let's say, there's a television in front of me, right? So I can say, I see the screen. The screen is not me. Why is the screen not me? It's not because of rational analysis. Nobody's done a scientific experiment to determine whether the screen outside is me or not. There's no trial on that. Why do we say that? It's very simple. I don't feel that. Nobody has questioned that. I've never questioned whether the screen is actually a part of me or not. Therefore, that screen is not me. It's out there, and it appears to be recognized generally the same by everybody else, and therefore that thing is physical. Right? That's a definition of physical. It's some pattern that is outside of oneself that is recognized by many people. Now, there's nothing that says that can't be mentality. In fact, the great example is the dream. Within a dream, every person within that dream can very logically say, this is a physical world. And look, we see that waterfall, it's physical. I can close my eyes, the waterfall is still there for you, it's physical. I can touch it, it's physical. It's relating at the level of the body, which is another shared sensation among people. It's physical. They can give all kinds of arguments, and guess what? They would be right. But if they were to have a shift in perspective such that that local mind within that dream could integrate with the broader mind that is dreaming, then it would say, oh, wait a second. What I saw as physicality and what all the scientists and philosophers argued for being physical, correctly so, by the way, in the dream, I now see is entirely and purely mental. But that only comes from a shift in identity. As long as I'm identified only as the local character, I can only see within that frame. That's the first mind frame, by the way, that we'll eventually talk about. But from that second mind, that dreaming mind frame, that dreaming mind recognizes that everything in that dream is made of itself, including the hammer, including the feather, including the thought and the intuition of the individual characters in that dream. Everything in that dream is made of that dreaming mind. That's the single lone ingredient of all the space-time events in that dream. And so what I'm saying is, when the person asks me, well, show this to me, prove this to me, what I would say is, look, this depends on your identity. When there's a shift, you recognize the same thing differently. And if they're interested, if they have that, a person who's interested is starting to go through some process anyway, then depending on that individuality, we can tug at certain elements of identity to kind of make that case and help that person see this perspective. Now, if a person is entirely kind of rooted in that materialist, right? And usually there's a fear there. There's a fear of coming out of that. Like, how could I possibly more than this? How could I be more than this body? What do you mean there are other beings in other dimensions? What do you mean that I existed before this body came out of my mother's womb? What do you mean that I will exist when this body stops moving? Like, this is crazy. This can go against a person's religious upbringing. It can go against what their parents told them to believe. It can go against a certain kind of safety that they've put themselves in. There are many reasons why people will argue against this, often sounding very intellectual, because of something that is not to do with rationality at all. So that's important to consider. However, if they're simply interested, they want some facts, I would just say things like you said. You can look at studies that Dean Radin did at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. You can look at the UVA Division of Perceptual Studies. You can go there on the website and just look at them. They did studies that showed the children remembered previous lifetimes, right? And forget previous lifetimes. Let's say I don't even believe in previous lifetimes. Children were describing times that they died. I don't know how you explain this without talking about previous lifetimes, but they were saying, this is how I died. They would describe in detail these events of how they died. And these researchers would go research and actually find these places and confirm it with the adults that, yes, a person died like this in this setting, right? So if they are able to do this, what does that suggest? That basically says that there's something from that other body that is still present in this body. Otherwise, how is there a memory, right? So that it's a case for a small kind of consciousness that is not restricted to a body, that even after death, that consciousness lives on and takes another form. So these are the kinds of I'd say little facts that you can give, or you can give, studies on ESP. There's tons of literature that's valid that shows that such experiences occur. However, what a person can see and appreciate is directly related, or I should say is inversely related to the degree of fear they have of stepping outside a worldview in which, frankly, I think because you were talking about your experiences, everything starts to change. Everything starts to change about who you are, how you see the world, how you interface, and the kinds of conversations you have. And especially if you're rooted not just culturally in a materialist framework, which almost all of us are in this society, but professionally also, then it becomes really hard to do something that is contrary to your training.
Indeed, it is the prevalent viewpoint.
Yes.
And I do think that one of the things that's come up around it I was very much kind of in reaction to what I was calling like a Western reductionist scientific viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a number of people on who are more science oriented, but we're making the case that it doesn't have to be reductionist,
mm-hmm.
that science isn't inherently reductionist.
Right.
And I guess, so what is it? What do you think are the implications of this consciousness-based reality that you're asserting for like healthcare? How does that change medicine if that's the case?
Well, man, so many ways. Number one is our model of anatomy. And that is that right now, we kind of pretend that a human being can be adequately modeled as a human physical body, right? And it's kind of this unspoken assumption that everybody seems to accept, at least in public life and professional life, implicitly, we all say that. I mean, it's a philosophical assumption, first of all, right? We try to say that healthcare is science-based or scientific, but the entire foundation is philosophy. I like to say that we doctors, all of us really, but I'll make the case with doctors that we are philosophers. We've all been trained in a philosophy that the body is most important and comes first. Why? Did anybody sit us down? No. Nobody sat us down in medical school or residency or fellowship and said, hey, by the way, the body is primary, the mind is secondary, body produces mind. By treating body, we can treat most things or all things. Right? Nobody said that because we don't realize that we're philosophers. We don't realize we are philosophizing. But that's exactly what we say. We say that this is the human being. It is not. It is a body. It's a physical body that we're drawing. And then we're saying that's our approach. So when somebody comes in with abdominal pain, for example, to the ER, right? What goes through our mind as ER docs is like looking at the anatomy and physiology of the area around the abdomen. Right? So you'll look at the intestines, you'll look at the pancreas, you'll look at the liver, you'll look at the spleen, you'll look at all the organs in and around the abdomen. And you'll look in the vicinity too. So you'll look at the heart above it, you'll look at the lungs, etc. Right? But the point is the map that we're using is that of physical anatomy, right? But you know that in some other cultures, like in yoga or in traditional Chinese medicine, the abdomen is not necessarily, or the organs are not necessarily localized. They're kind of forces or energies, and something that could be happening in the abdomen that's happening somewhere else completely, or that's happening in the mind could be showing up in the abdomen.
Yeah, so, your liver can be in your foot and stuff like that,
exactly,
right?
That's exactly right, right? Because the liver is not thought of as a physical structure. It's thought of as an energy. It's thought of as a field. And so you can look for it in different places. So that when you start moving towards a consciousness-based perspective, you have to expand your model of anatomy radically. So I talk about 5 bodies, for example. I talk about the physical body, the mental body, the energetic body, the informational body, and consciousness itself as the primary body. And going from 5, the outermost layer of physical, down to 1, the primary body of consciousness. And as long as we're looking strictly at the physical structure, all of our diagnoses and treatments are going to be limited to that. And that's why we have so many incurable diseases. That's why there's so much dissatisfaction in healthcare. People feel like they're not seen. Why? Because we're approaching everything through physicality as if that's the gateway to everything. It is an important gateway, but it's a fraction of the whole picture. So that's one way in which, as you move towards a consciousness-based perspective, the way of diagnosing and the way of treating is going to change, because we will have more stuff to work with. And that's what integrative medicine is starting to do. They're looking at the mental body of thoughts and emotions, and also looking at the energetic body of, let's say, chakras and meridians and things like that, to try to get to a more multi-directional way of healing, meaning that you can start in the energetic body and affect the mental and physical body, but you can start in the mental body, affect the energetic and the physical body, and so on, right? It's a more multi-directional approach, rather than saying we start with physicality, we end with physicality, and we hope that everything works out, right? Even in psychiatry today, the primary way, the mechanism based on our anatomy, is through adjusting neurotransmitters, right? It's not. Psychiatry, it literally begins with mind, psych, right? But we're still focused on physicality because that's the training that we get. So that's number one, is a much broader understanding and deeper understanding of anatomy. The other thing that would happen is that we would totally invert our understanding of complementary medicine and conventional medicine. Most people don't know that modern medicine, what I practice in the ER, is the true complementary medicine. And what we speak about as the 4 engines, which are nutrition, movement, connection, and rest, are actually the true conventional medicine, because that has been practiced by convention for millennia. Right? Modern medicine, we can say maybe 50, 100, 150 years, something like that, right? We're talking about millennia of nutrition, movement, connection, and rest, which are the bedrock of so many of these indigenous traditions. That is the true conventional medicine. What I practice in the ER is amazing, but you better believe and understand that that is the true complementary medicine. If anybody is seeing allopathy as conventional and not complementary, you will have a public health crisis on your hands. And that is what is happening today, right? How do you know it's complementary? Here's a way you know. If you take pills and surgery away, many people will still live very well. If you take nutrition, movement, connection, and rest away, nobody will live. Okay? Yeah. So which is conventional and which is complementary? See, there's this kind of word game, this inversion of understanding that's literally killing people. Literally killing people, because we don't understand that it's kind of this word game that's happening, and we need to start speaking clearly about this. And I can tell you, Jay, that if we expand our understanding of anatomy, and if we invert the misunderstanding and start to see that modern medicine is complementary medicine and nutrition, movement, connection, and rest are conventional, people will heal from diseases left and right in ways that we have not yet understood. And in fact, we have those people on our Healing is Possible podcast. We talk about people that have healed from all kinds of stuff by attending to these 4 engines and by treating modern medicine as it should be treated, as complementary medicine, where it's very effective.
Yeah, I've certainly seen that to be true in my own body and other people's bodies, because, my focus in my life has been a lot about healing. And I think a lot of yoga teachers got very caught up in the physicalities of yoga practice. Yes. And then many of us, as time went on, realized it was all about consciousness. Yeah. But I guess what I'm curious about is that, when you talk about those different bodies that you mentioned, that is sort of like when we've talked about like a biopsychosocial, and sometimes people add like a biopsychosocial spiritual. They'll add the spiritual on the end. Right. And I guess the thing is, and it goes back to what I was sort of starting with earlier, is that I guess the question has always become, is that because there is such an entrenched, already prevalent power structure and worldview, it seems like there's not the same kind of objective metrics for chakras as there is blood cell counts. So it seems like we're needing to challenge these systems on some other, like not on their terms or something.
Right.
Is that what the three minds is? Why is that why you're always using the three minds framework? We mentioned it earlier. Let's bring it up now because I saw that you use this three minds framework as a way of kind of explaining some of these things. How does that fit in, and where does that come from?
Yeah. So this goes back to the recognition problem. And so we need to measure the white blood cell count. We need to measure the blood pressure. We need to measure the heart rate. Why? Because we want to understand certain things about people, right? We want to know certain things about people. So the whole point of, let's say, chakras, for example, is more about understanding ourselves and then seeing that in somebody else, right? I cannot, let's say, measure the activity of a chakra per se. But the question is, do we need to, right? What we need to measure really is outcomes, right? So if a person does A, do they feel better? Do they get better? Can they restore function, etc.? Does it really matter whether I can measure it or not? Measurement is not an end in and of itself. Measurement is always a means to getting to an end. So, and measurement always depends on our recognition, right? I'll give you a simple example. Can I measure the window in your house now? No, I can't. Why? Because I don't perceive it. I don't recognize it. It's a recognition problem. But if I could recognize it, if I came there, if you had that experience of your window and you said, hey, Anoop, here's the window, and I had the experience of the window, we're sharing an experience, I can understand it more. I can get the feel of it, the texture, the form, and maybe even measure it, right? So chakras right now are like the windows in your house in society. It's very few people experience it. So how can we even talk about measuring it when we don't have a language, right? It's like talking about the wind in somebody's hair when they're riding a bicycle, but nobody's ridden a bicycle before, right? How could you even approach measuring that? So I think that goes back to the recognition problem, which is so important. And secondly, like I said, measurement itself is a means. And if people are getting better by virtue of whatever method, then how much do I need to measure it if we can reproduce that effect even without measuring? So those are the couple of things I was saying there. That's not putting down measuring. That's just putting measuring in context, that we measure because we need to measure to get to a result. But maybe we don't need, if we can get to the result itself, and if we can reproduce it and help ourselves and others regularly, then do we need to measure that? Or is it really an experience we need to share? That's the question we need to ask. Now, let me get to the three minds here. The reason, to be quite frank, that I came up with the three minds is really out of necessity. It came to a point in my life where the way I was experiencing the world, I couldn't really explain, and I probably had to come to a point where I had to keep it within and kind of leave society in a sense, either mentally or even like physically in a sense. Or I had to stay in society and find a way to communicate this, because it was so different. Even, by the way, even with the depth of Advaita that I was exposed to, and I'm very grateful for growing up, I was in it all the time, and even with that, when it came to a change in my own experience of living, I felt like I needed a language that I could directly connect with, and it would be authentically my language so that I could speak to people about this, because there were a lot of people I could see that were asking about this, interested in this, and really wanted something that wasn't strictly in the spiritual framework or in a religious framework or even strictly in a scientific framework, but something that was versatile. I wanted that kind of openness and versatility. So the way it seemed to me then, which was of course consistent with Advaita, this is not something brand new. This is as old as the hills, right? It's been said in different traditions. But the way it came to me is that there are essentially three primary ways in which identity is configured. And by that I mean three ways in which we experience ourselves. And what is fundamentally important is that the way we experience ourselves is the way that we experience the world. Now, we've all heard this before, that what you see or what you know is kind of reflected in the world, right? So I'm unhappy, I see an unhappy world.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.